Welcome back to HED 241, Biostatistics and Public Health. We are on Part A, Chapter 2, Types of Empirical Research. So I'm going to go through the types of empirical research, and then I'm going to go back and do some examples for you. So empirical research, what is it? So it's really distinguished between non-experimental and experimental research. So in non-experimental designs, there are no treatments. So non-experimental, no treatment. They're descriptive in nature, they're exploratory. So looking at like the relationship between factors, things like that. Experimental designs is when treatments are administered. They're predictive in nature. Then when the study tests for predictive questions or theories to address the effectiveness or possible cause and effect. Okay. Non-experimental study is defined as a study in which observations are made to determine the status of what exists at a given point in time without administering treatments. It involves descriptive questions of who, what, when, where, and how much or how many of a various aspect. So an example would be a survey to determine participants' attitudes could be administered to obtain solid data on the attitudes held by participants. This is requiring a sample and well-crafted questions that's collected typically through a survey. The study has not gathered data on how to change the attitudes that would be required of an experimental study. So in a non-experimental, think of it this way. Let me explain this way. This is the way I was actually taught the difference, okay? You have a frog. And in a non-experimental study, you observe the frog. You watch the frog, okay? You don't ever touch the frog. You just watch it. An experimental study, you poke the frog. You treat the frog. You give the frog medicine. You mess with the frog, and you see what happens. That's an experimental design. So non-experimental, you just watch the frog. You might talk to the frog, but you don't do anything to the frog. Experimental design, you poke the frog, touch the frog, you get the frog Tylenol, see what happens, okay? That's the difference. So experimental, you actually do something. Non-experimental, you just observe. Okay, so the treatment in an experimental design is called the independent variable, and the response is the dependent. So using the frog, when you poke the frog, that's your treatment, or your Tylenol is your treatment, and that's your independent variable. The response, maybe the frog jumps. That's your dependent variable. Okay. The purpose is to identify cause and effect relationships. We're going to go through these examples a little bit more in just a minute, but when a waiter decides to be more friendly, independent variable, to see if it increases his tips, dependent. Okay. Informal experiments can be misleading. Does the increased friendliness cause an increase in the tips? The increase in the tips may be due to other factors, such as the customer happens to be more generous. An advice columnist published a column that day on tipping. The waiter was unconsciously also more efficient, and it was the efficiency that caused the increase in the tips. Okay. For a more clear interpretation, the research needs an appropriate control condition. For an example of friendliness and tipping, the waiter could be friendlier to every alternate party of customers. This group is called the experimental group. The remaining customers who receive the normal amount of friendliness is referred to as control. The waiter's behavior can be monitored to be sure that it is the same for both groups of customers in all respects, except for the degree of friendliness. Then the difference in the amount of tip can be compared to measure the effect of friendliness. So thinking that through, you have a waiter, you have 10 tables. Actually, I'm going to come back to that because we're going to talk about that in just a second. Hold on, I'm going to give you a visual example. So remember this example? We're going to come back to it. Okay? When we talk about different types of empirical research, we really are focusing on this experimental, non-experimental. So as the textbook stated, we are all conducting informal experiments in our everyday lives. We do it all the time. We don't even realize it. For example, we might try a new laundry detergent. We might consider whether our clothes are cleaner using the new detergent or the old detergent? Hey, I bought this cheaper, and I really did. I bought some cheap detergent not long ago on Amazon. It was on sale, and I'll be honest with you, I don't like it as much. Yeah, it was cheaper, but it's really not working. I inadvertently did a experimental design, right? An experiment is a study in which treatments are given to see how participants respond to them. In our example, the new laundry detergent is the treatment, and the cleaner clothes is the response. Okay. Another example in the textbook is that the waiter might be trying to become more friendly to see if it increases his or her tips. In this example, the friendlier waitress is the response, and the friendlier waiter is the treatment, and more tips is the response. In an experiment, the treatments are called the independent variable, and the responses are called the dependent. Independent variables are administered so researchers can observe possible changes in the dependent variable. Okay, so you have the friendly waitress in the treatment, hoping for a response of more tips. Okay, independent, dependent. Okay. Independent variables are administered so that researchers can observe possible changes in dependent variables. Went through this slowly for a reason. Make sure you know the difference between these. The purpose of an experiment is to identify the cause and effect relationship. And looking at our example of friendlier waitress or waiters earning more tips, we would say the possible cause is a waitress being friendlier. The possible effect is more tips. We as researchers are interested in finding out whether the increased friendliness of the waiter or waitresses causes those increased tips. Okay. Or do alternate explanations exist for the increased tips? So this is what I touched on a few minutes ago, the idea that maybe it was actually an article in the newspaper, maybe it's just a really generous person. Maybe the waitress, in addition to trying to be more friendly, is also being more efficient. So, do alternate explanations exist for the increased tips? It's possible, right? So, what do you do in those cases? Okay. So, you look here. Okay. How can an experiment on friendliness and tipping work? For instance, we could have a waiter and be friendlier to every alternate party. Okay. The remaining customers would receive the normal amount. Okay. All right. This would be your experiment group. They're being extremely friendly. This is your red group over here, being extremely friendly to this group, going above and beyond, right? Here, they're being friendly, they're still being nice, they're still being polite, they're still doing their job really well, but not as friendly, right? So here, in addition, we can monitor the waiter's behavior to make sure it's the same for both, okay? So by having the different tables and treating them a little bit differently, see then and compare the tips, okay? We could then use statistics to compare the average tip earned under the more friendly condition with those earned under the less friendly condition, right? So if they're friendly, they get like double the tips here where they were friendlier. You never know. Okay, you would use statistics that we're going to learn about in this class to see the difference. Okay, so now thinking again on a non-experimental study, which is again a descriptive study. Observations are made to determine the status of what exists at a given time without the administration of treatment. So without poking the frog, what's going on? Okay. An example may be a survey in which the researcher wants to determine participants' attitudes. Let's say the researcher wants to determine the student's attitude towards older adults. Okay. The researcher tries not to change the participant's attitude. They just want to measure what the student's attitudes are. If the sample is properly drawn and the questions are well crafted, a researcher can obtain solid data on the attitudes held by the students. It's important to note that the researcher who did a non-experimental study on the attitudes has not gathered data on how to change attitudes. To do this, the researcher would need to conduct an experiment. Remember, this is a non-experimental study in which no treatments are administered. So they cannot see how to change it. They're just looking at what their attitudes are. So that's a real quick overview of Chapter 2. Make sure you read the chapter and follow on Canvas what questions you have for your assignment. As always, let me know if you have any questions or concerns.